Well, thanks again for Shima to consider me for discussant role for this very phenomenal talk. Congratulations. I think it's really vital research that's necessary in moving, I think, focus of academic research on to so far primarily 60s Japan in area of study of contemporary Japanese art, and in 70s we, like Julian mentioned, that we lack significant resource of these central archive. Nothing is central. We have to constantly go back to artists, and artists are also aiding and getting constantly passing away every year, and we are really in the middle of this crisis.
Yeah, that happens.
Yeah, so we need to move on quickly to 70s, and so I really appreciate your efforts. So what I just did, because I didn't have a manuscript and had a different abstract, right? It wasn't primarily focused on equivalence. Your abstract was a tiny bit different, so I prepared of content of something he touched upon, which was from space to environment. The exhibition that I primarily researched around 2007 to 2008 and published in Art Journal article about how they organized this multidisciplinary exhibition consisting of 38 artists and critics and industrial designer. I actually kept some of those people, in case you might not be familiar. Industrial designer, graphic designer, Awazu Kiyoshi was heavily involved. And actually you mentioned of that his legendary basin, water basin, right? Is that the one you're referring to in that space to environment? I tried to research that as well, but I couldn't really find any archival information. So I did go back to his son, and so I maybe that's another small question about Awazu's particular work in this from space to environment. So like Julian, my research actually was focusing on term kankyo in Japanese meaning environment, and how that was really significant in this 1966. It's really a dawn of intermedia art in Japan, so to speak, and kankyo was somewhat interchangeably used with intermedia. So before intermedia word, the English word was brought into Japan in even later 60s, even though some Fluxus associated artists such as Ayo would come back to Japan in 66, and he was actually engaged in an event program of this from kankyo, from space to environment. So there was some knowledge of intermedia already in 66, but it didn't really maybe sink in until, so to speak, until 68. So as he actually narrated the difference between space and kankyo environment, I actually dwelled on this particular part because in your abstract you kept using the word space, so I was thinking that it might be concentrated on more of a formalist analysis of space, rather than the sort of political connotation that's involved in kukan, this dichotomy of kukan and kankyo. That was like a central issue when these artists were engaged in this, mounting this exhibition. There was a debate of heavily regarding this issue, and most recently there was publication by Sawaragi Inoue, a critic who published a book called World Fairs and World Wars. He actually really focused on political connotation of kankyo that goes back all the way to World War II, in which Tange Kenzo, the architect, was involved in designing war memorial for the deceased, and that was to be erected around the foot of Mount Fuji, and that was to involve all the land and the people and the environment, and environment was used in this sort of semi-nationalistic tone back then in the 1930s. So Sawaragi brings back that memory of war involved in the usage of kankyo. So my question for Julian, one first was that politicality, the political connotation of the word environment, and how that might have maybe affected these artists, or they didn't really weren't concerned at this point after Expo 70. After Expo 70, so many artists were really bashing the Expo participants. It was almost black and white world where artists were divided into enemies and friends, and so there was a real critical rupture in 1970. Although I really value Julian's efforts in looking into the continuation of critical discourse from the late 60s on to 70s. So, for example, the From Space to Environment included Fluxus work by I.O. as sort of low-tech version of intermedia interactive art. And Ichiyanagi Toshi's sound sculpture that was essentially form of theremin, the theremin device that was surrounded by a mirror surface. So viewer can interact with the hand and changes the sound. Actually, Tone Yasunao right there is interacting with the work. He's everywhere. And Yamaguchi Katsuhiro is another figure. I think in addition to Awazu Kiyoshi you mentioned, actually Yamaguchi and these people are also often frequented, supposedly, to see even show in Gutai Pinacoteca in the 60s, and that's how the Gutai artist Imai Norio was recruited to exhibit in this seminal exhibition, Kukan Kara Kankyo e. So that might be another place to look into also in terms of continuation. And he mentioned that my research on influence on Japanese intermedia or kankyo goes back all the way to Kiesler's notion of co-realism, which was translated and studied by both Yamaguchi Katsuhiro and his mentor, Shuzo Takiguchi, is art critic, and he was involved in surrealism. And of course, Kaplo's seminal book was published in the very year when this exhibition was mounted, so I kind of make this connection. So, about the Kyoto Revolution Committee, before they moved on to this critique of artistic institution and maybe through films and other media, they were really, in a way, critical environment society, and people who were involved in environment society ended up participating in Expo 70. So they were, sort of black and white right before 1970. So I'm just wondering how they reconciled that rupture maybe after 1970. This is a diagram developed by my friend and the scholar who lives in New York, Reiko Tomi, and this clarifies that how anti-art dissolves by late 60s, and actually 66 is not clearly noted, but it's right around end of Highlight Center is 64, so you can 66 I think is actually the end of the Highlight Center line. And from then, non-art, Kigeijutsu, art of not making, for example, even including works by Monoha, School of Things, is sort of included in that. But Kyoto is right underneath of it. It's the most critical artist committee that was involved in coming out of student movement to critique of art. So this, critical part, the political part, how do you maybe can incorporate into maybe your paper? I know it gets too much. It becomes a little bit too much, but that expanded 60 notion is framed by both two movements of anti-U.S. and Japan security treaty movement. So, and in the 70s was the same thing. For those who might not be familiar, in the 1960s there was a first ample demonstration that was against the renewal Japan and U.S. security treaty, and then that was failed in this May, and then also 1970 was the same way. Actually, it's like the protest energy was there, but they didn't really get anything in the end. So I think that affects this generation of the 70s artists. Not making, they turn really severely nihilistic, even more than the anti-art generation. And it's also interesting the fact that they were also, these Kyoto artists were dropouts from college, that they were originally engaged in students' movements, but then they become college dropouts. And there was one clarification on their manifesto of not exhibiting for a year. I think there's one term that maybe wasn't translated in the original translation, says not to exhibit in a museum and gallery for a year, but they are actually making a pact to exhibit in alternative space with a charge, admission charged. I think the admission charged part wasn't translated somehow, so I thought that's like a critical nuance there, that they wanted to exhibit out of museum space, not necessarily saying they're not going to exhibit for a year. And these are the pictures of 1970. Now I'll stop here, but so this is Butai Art Festival at Expo 70, and we are so lucky to have had a series of Japan involved exhibitions in New York lately, so you might have become more and more familiar with Butai's involvement in Expo 70 as well. That was criticized by their Tokyo counterparts, and we need to definitely understand that political context as well. And Awazuki Yoshifu was involved. I actually edited a volume of a journal concentrated on artist ambivalent responses to Expo 70, because it was just not that black and white. All these artists who were involved in it had a really degree of ambivalence, and Awazuki Yoshi was one of the most ambivalent, as maybe you might have pointed out. He did this extraordinary multi-screen display at the expo, but he wanted to bring in some critical elements against the expo in the content. For example, he wanted to display something about the nuclear Holocaust and so on. So there was a struggle there. So I wanted to see that. What your take on the Expo 70 and how that becomes distilled in later 70s. So, but that's about my comment. I don't know the format in which.
It's just very informative. I mean, I had one question in terms of the sort of opposition or ambivalence about Expo 70 and particularly corporate sponsorship of Expo 70. And I mean, if you look at the pinhole camera piece, which doesn't necessarily involve high technology or corporate sponsorship, and I mean, that is the big problem, is how do you get around access to equipment at a time when it was arguably less accessible than it would be now? If you want to take an oppositional position, how can you still engage with media works or works in projection or video even later, that without getting involved with this kind of corporate culture of technology?
Well, in that on that point, I was very intrigued because your later focus was on discotheque, and that's in a way avant-garde art, so to speak, when underground and found the sponsorship in night, the commercial domain of the nightclubs. So that's a very interesting way of surviving this type of the instance of survival of intermedia art in Japan, because it was in a way so critically attacked right around the expo that right after that nobody could do similar thing anymore without really exposing themselves to criticism. So I think the Julian's artists primarily were picking up on low-tech medium, like you were saying, the slide projectors and film projectors.
Yeah. Well, maybe if I could respond to that. I mean, in terms of intermedia, it's often talked about how it gets strongly associated with the Expo 70, but I've done some research where I found groups like the 8th Generation Collective, who were one of the key sort of anti-Expo artists who staged a lot of protests against the Expo. They continued to use the word intermedia in 1970 and after 1970. So I propose a different sort of approach to thinking of intermedia, because I don't actually think that, and also the Zero Jigen, who were also part of the anti-Expo struggles, were participating in an event that had intermedia in its title just after the Expo. So I'm thinking perhaps intermedia and its association with Expo 70 has been something that's been attached afterwards. I mean, if you still talk to artists of Zero Jigen and 8th Generation, they look disgusted when I ask them about intermedia, and they say, "Oh, that's for those with lots of money." But so I'm sort of struggling through with this paper to understand what intermedia exactly meant to these artists. Especially intermedia comes into Japan a little differently to environment, as you've noted. It came through, I think, the Fluxus network, but also the first written article that I found that introduced intermedia was Imura Takahiko's essay that introduced expanded cinema works that he saw in New York in 1966. And if you see intermedia, the event in Rurami Gallery, and 6 months later, most of the activities that happened there are what we call now expanded cinema works, or works that involve film projection at least.
So maybe it's really morphed into the film activities. Perhaps through Imura.
Through Imura, and also Ishizaki Koichiro, mainly a film critic, and then it sort of expands outwards into more crosstalk intermedia and Expo 70, which requires more technology and corporate sponsorship, whereas before its origins in Japan at least started in a small gallery space. So a part of my paper I want to sort of propose looking at intermedia a little bit differently as an activity that didn't actually end at 1970. There are a couple of examples of events using the word intermedia after 1970, and suggest maybe we should sort of reconsider intermedia to have survived after 1970. Yeah. I mean,
I just wanted to ask a related question about the use of the term intermedia and how it was either mistranslated or productively translated from the essay written by Dick Higgins. And you were making a distinction between the synthesis and intermedia, and I wondered a little bit about the categorization of each, since intermedia proposed a kind of in-betweenness of media rather than necessarily distinct media that interrelated. So I was just wondering if that was the reading of the artist or your reading, and how maybe that sort of produced a different understanding. Or
I'm really interested in how these sort of words like intermedia, environment, and display, which aren't Japanese words, come into Japan. And I think one way to look at it is they were sort of hoping to refer to it in a way that provided them something else from what they had in sort of their own language beforehand. And I think intermedia and Sogo Geijutsu is a perfect example for this. Sogo Geijutsu was discussed primarily in the 50s, but as an approach to art that brought different sort of mediums together, which is sort of what gets discussed later as intermedia. But in the 50s, that gets sort of worked out through Jinken Kobo experimental workshops, artworks. But then by 1960, a lot of artists and critics are sort of get already sick of it and say, it's just, you're just adding mediums together to just provide this sort of spectacle, and it's just not working. Yeah, that's synthesis arts. Yeah. So that gets sort of criticized by 1960. So by the time intermedia comes into Japan in 1966, these artists and critics are looking for different sort of terminology to discuss artistic art interaction between mediums. Mm-hmm. So you find in essays explicit references to how intermedia differs from Sogo Geijutsu by critics and artists like Tony Asunao, Ichikawa Miyabi. They mention what used to be Sogo Geijutsu and what we can now see in intermedia. And the difference, they say, at the time, is that Sogo Geijutsu was about uniting different arts to sort of create a synthesis, whereas intermedia is a mixed sort of condition whereby all these different medias are coexisting, but not necessarily sort of blurring into each other.
That's not how Dick Higgins wrote about it.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, I mean, Dick Higgins doesn't even get mentioned in Imura's essay.
Yeah, true.
And I mean, at the Intermedia Art Festival, because of the strong association with the Fluxus artists, there were reenactments. Performances based on the Fluxus instructions of performances done at Intermedia Art Festival. There's a few of Dick Higgins' works there, but yeah, he barely gets mentioned otherwise. So. And I've not seen a translation of his essay until way after the 60s. So yeah, it's one of those things. I think they sort of interpreted to fit their own needs for the new art to come. It seems, yeah.
Yeah, they did absorb differently, the word term happenings and events as well. They conflated the two pretty often.
I thank you also for this incredibly rich talk. Most of this material is new to me, so I'm hearing in your presentation, though, two narratives. One is a more familiar narrative of good and bad objects, where Expo 70 is bad and the avant-garde or underground is good, where abstract space is bad and environment is good, where passivity is bad and interactivity and activity are good, where synthesis is bad and understanding the individual components or collage or intermedia are good. But that's the traditional avant-garde, at least in the West, the traditional avant-garde narrative. In the case of expanded cinema, would be something of an East Coast, West Coast divide.
Yeah.
So Gene Youngblood is bad, spectacle, etc., and good is structural film. And if you go a little further east, get structural materialist film in London or Germany or what have you. So that's one narrative that seems to be poking up on occasion, and is clearly important historically, and I don't want to minimize it. The other narrative, which is also at play here, which I think is quite different and to me very intriguing, is this narrative where the good and bad objects can never quite be divided neatly. And certainly the whole question of display, for what it's worth, Kiesler wrote a book on display, including shop window display in 1930. It's his first big American publication. I don't know if there was any reception in Japan, but Kiesler is one of these figures for whom these divisions don't quite work out. This introduction of really fascinating discussions of the discotheques and the nightclubs and things that sound almost like they're out of an Austin Powers movie in their purple fur walls and lasers. going back into Expo 70 and to an underground culture, again, makes figures like Robert Whitman, who's, of course, in Japan in 70, but also even Warhol. So Whitman, who is being rehabilitated in many respects right now in very interesting ways. Even though at the time he was criticized for being a bit too slick, as Brandon Joseph quotes Jonas Mekas, and a bit too slick. Much of this work to me seems a little bit too slick, right? In ways that are to me interesting. And even someone like Warhol and the EPI and the exploding plastic inevitables and these immersive environments that also gave way to underground, to nightclubs, and so forth. So on the one hand is a narrative of us versus them, good versus bad, underground avant-garde versus corporate, expo, etc. On the other hand is a much more fluid, much less black-white world. And I'm wondering if you can, so I'm sensing both narratives at play in your talk, and I'm wondering if you can tease them out a bit for us. What's your take on this? Where do you stand on these issues? Are there specific moments where these divisions are pronounced and when they're much less pronounced? Expo 70 clearly one of those moments of it being more pronounced, but does this vary? Are we looking at a consistent history? Are we looking at moments of interaction and fusion and moments of real distance and hostility? Can you parse out these two narratives for us in the late 60s into the 70s?
Sure. Like what I would like to propose is that I think it was much more complicated than good and bad. Although there is that narrative, and there's some importance in stating that, because there were very heated discussions about the expo and artists' involvement in it. I would like to suggest that there are other ways of looking at the expo, in the sense that many of these so-called sort of underground artists were participating in things like the disco set with some sponsorship and engineering collaborations being one of them, and also the sort of performance artists collaborating with such underground filmmakers and artists working in such areas. I think, for example, Zerojigen is a perfect example for this, because there are sort of now considered and then considered the sort of most prominent anti-expo artists, but they were working with filmmakers who used multiple projection. They staged performances in expanded cinema environments with artists such as Miyaidi Kuro, and who made some of these discotheques. So I think there is a tendency in Japanese looking at Japanese postwar avant-garde art to sort of, divide these artists into the good and the bad, as you say. But I think there was much more interactions that I would like to sort of research further into than this sort of framework suggests. So, yeah, I would. For example, Tony Asano is like a great example, because he's always around everywhere, it seems.
And writing,
and writing about a lot, and he, of course, he wasn't involved in Expo 70 or even Crosstalk Intermedia, but he continues to collaborate with the artists that are involved in Expo 70, etc. So, yeah, and then he takes a sort of leading role in the Kyoto Revolution Committee as an advisor to these younger artists. So, yeah, some of the ideas that he helps sort of elaborate in the 60s sort of live on into the 70s. Intermedia sort of splits, I would suggest, to the technological sort of spectacle that is Expo 70, but more the underground works in discotheques, and I suggest later the film installations. Yeah. So yeah, I would like to suggest it's a little more complicated than good and bad, but that's the sort of usual narrative, if I feel.
I think it's a productive complication. So.
Yeah, thanks.
I wonder, you mentioned 77 as the last year for the exhibition series.
Mm-hmm.
Was that in the West, 77, late 70s sort of marks an end of an era? 77 is Documenta 6 with the ultimate failed attempt to bring video and film into galleries. 79 is Film is Film in England and then on the continent. There are a series of exhibitions that really are more almost epitaphs to film action, film installation, these types of activities than what they imagine themselves to be, which is the opening onto a whole new great era. And then we have a bit of a fallow period until video projectors come around. Is it anything of that narrative apply in Japan? Is the late 70s, as far as you go, is that where you wanted to push the end from 70 in Expo to the late 70s? Is that your new ending, so to speak, and then things die down a bit? I'm just wondering in terms of categorization and historical framing, what's the significance of, what's the end point for you if not 1970?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question that I need to think further into, because I've not really put my sort of approach to this research was take out the framework and sort of renegotiate these interactions into something else. So putting a framework again is not something I had really considered. But you're right. I mean, video art in gallery spaces and museum spaces becomes very important in the 70s. These filmmakers who worked in expanded cinema and early film installations start working heavily in video. And I mean, I think they continue into the 70s and even 80s, to be honest. But I guess that sort of explosive period for at least the Kyoto artists for the contemporary plastic art exhibition series comes to an end by the end of the 70s. Yeah, so I'd have to rethink that question of how to frame it. If not Expo, where do we point the turning point? But yeah, for now, that's all I can offer. But maybe you can help me there.
Well, I thought that maybe it's also discotheque was maybe absorbing it in a way. It's that film installations become sort of dissolved into popular culture, so to speak. Maybe that's what's happening. And also the turn of technology from film to video, that anybody can buy a video camera.
Right.
Take the ubiquitousness of the media. Maybe I don't know if that's the case also in the term in the West.
Yeah, I mean it's not entirely clear. Things seem to implode, right? But I'm not sure. I think Stuart's written on this as well. I'm not sure that there's a definitive single answer as to why the movement seems to really implode by the end of the 70s. And I would not assume for a moment that whatever was at stake in London or New York necessarily applies to Tokyo or Kyoto. But that's become the de facto periodization, at least in the West, and to hear, again, echoes of it just make me wonder, can we draw some parallels, some connections, and begin to make sense of it? I'm not certain. I would open it up if.
But also, I mean, you mentioned the Film is Film exhibition, and that was the catalog for that exhibition was Liz Rhodes' essay, denouncing the exhibition for having invited her as the only woman, and then she and Annabelle Nicholson and a dozen other women, write one of the most articulate feminist critiques of the entire experimental film enterprise. And I don't know, were those sorts of gender discussions even happening in Japan? Or, I mean, we talked about, even the Kukan, as a political notion of space. I mean, a lot of presentations we've had for CMAP have been much more about street demonstrations or spaces in which projection would be impossible, and I think then how do you just tease out what kinds of politics or political discussions were actually being had, and how did that play into how certain things might have come to a close or morphed into something else, not just through technology like video, but through specific micro-political conversations about issues of gender or class or other.
There's some feminism in that time, but I don't know, it bubbles, but I can't say, I don't think it was as fervent as here. It certainly was there.
I think it's interesting that most of the women artists in the media in Japan maybe have taken on video instead of film, right?
Well, but I think there are all kinds of reasons, and not everybody had a video camera. They were very expensive. They're expensive there. They're expensive here, and those companies didn't give any money. The government gave no money. People shared equipment. They came together. So, and we all know that collectives are very short-lived. They come for a moment, for a need, and then they disperse. So, and then people had influence, like Bill Viola when he was there. Then you started to see viola clones, and it suited the aesthetic because of the craftness and the, part of the culture is very, how well something is made is important, and when it's the underground, no, it doesn't have to be well made. But so you have all those issues, and museums did not show. You can't say to me that there were a lot of shows. There were not many shows. There were a handful. When Nam June Paik had his show at the Tokyo National Museum, or Shinji Komoto did various shows in Kansai when he could, or Keiji Nakamura supported it, when he could. And Nakamura had great interest in video and media for many years, and wrote about it a lot. So one person who never comes up, and I'm curious, and that's Shuichi Ida, who used film and video and did installations. And I'm curious if he's just this oddball who's coming out of printmaking, but he did installations using, video quite early.
Right.
So I just wonder if his name had ever come up.
Actually, for me, it's the first time.
First time, okay.
I'll have to look into it.
Because he's Kyoto. I mean, he died maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah.
He's in the MoMA collection as a printmaker.
Right. Yeah.
Hardly paid attention to anymore.
Well, perhaps I'll try to. Yeah.
I think David Hall is still a sculptor in New York, but
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's interesting that there's so many of the film artists that worked in film installations came out of Kyoto rather than Tokyo. I guess there was more sort of video equipment ready at hand, or interest towards that in Tokyo.
Well, I think there are some reasons. Like Toshio Matsumoto taught in a technical school, or he came out of printmaking. He really understood what an image is, and had many students. And then people also like Hitoshi Nomura was working with sound and image, and then. Because I hung out a lot with the dumb type artists early on, I knew them all when they were graduating from art school. So they all talked about a professor at their school who had been in England and did performance at the time that Stuart Brisley and people were working. And that fellow had a very big influence on Morimura and others in Kansai. So it would be, I think, be interesting to pick up that thread at some point. But that, of course, is somebody who emigrated and then came back, and that's for women. I'm sure, are well aware. The diaspora, many women did leave because it was no picnic, unless you were a very wealthy person, as some of them were, and then you could do whatever you wanted.
Yeah, Idemitsu left and lived in LA for a while. That's true.
Yeah.
Nakaya Fujiko is giving a talk at Japan Society. He was part of EAT and part of the video.
She just had a piece open at the Philip Johnson Glass House on Saturday, which I went to. Yeah.
Oh, that was
How long is it
Saturday.
there? How long is it there?
Oh, it's there for like months.
Oh, wow.
And she's going to do a fog piece up in Sapporo.
And maybe just to mention also, Imai Norio's doing a lot of shows in New York.
Gallery Richard, right?
Yes, he just showed at the Gallery Richard and
In Chelsea.
yeah, and in Osaka Art Court Gallery, he's reinstalling the jointed film, one of the series of works where he used the local television productions, cut up films. So he's sort of going back to his early film installations more recently.
He did a performance there at the Gallery Richard in Chelsea.
Oh yes,
using
yeah.
a female dancer on a table, and it's actually closed circuit video. That her image was projected on her body as she was moving across on the table, and then he painted white.
Right. Yeah, this projection onto bodies, in particular female bodies, by male artists is something that kept recurring in Japan in the mid-60s, and especially in the culture of discotheques, where these what were called go-go girls were hired to dance on a stage where they were in this projection.
Actually, I had the image of this one too. Textile Pavilion at Osaka Expo had a Matsumoto Toshio's projection Ako that was all about female body and fractured, and looks like a nude descending staircase, but it was projected onto a sculpture that was designed by Yoko Tadanori. He's a graphic designer, but he did the design of actual architecture as well as the sculpture onto which was projected. So it was highly, as you might suspect, gendered field in the 70s, although I haven't really getting into that criticism of gender issue.
But then you'd also mentioned that one projection was on a trans person, and if you look at like Shuji Teriyama and a lot of others, I mean, they were really looking at spaces between conventional genders. So
that's right,
I mean, that would be an interesting path to follow, maybe too.
Yeah.
Julian, you said that the slide projections are relatively neglected. Where are most of these materials now?
Okay, yeah.
Are they scattered, or are they in?
Yeah, very much scattered. I've had to be in touch. I've got in touch with the artists, and for example, Shuzo Ajusi Gulliver, who's a expanded cinema artist who worked from 1967 in performative projection. He had a lot of slide projection works, but when he was approached by the Museum of Modern Art Tokyo to sort of restore and look at how we could access his video and film works, his slides were completely ignored. So he just had them in his basement, sort of untouched. So it seems like it's being completely neglected. Same with Takahiko Imura. He had a few performances that involved film projection and slide projection, and I also found his slides just dumped in a cardboard box, untouched since these performances. So and just for my future research, I think I would like to look into the slide projection as something that these artists are using, because often they were installed or staged together with film projection, but that sort of distinction hasn't really been explored, I feel, the difference between slide and moving image and what it means to bring them together. There's been a few exhibitions and writing on slideshows as installations, but not so much on performance. So perhaps, that's a direction I would like to take this research into, particularly because I feel they're being neglected, not just for research, but in terms of archival efforts as well.
And the film installations are also scattered, or are some of them lost?
It's difficult because it's, of course, it's a spatial sort of presentation. So, in some cases there are diagrams in the collection of cards that I showed. They're quite helpful for the equivalent cinema exhibition because the artists have drawn diagrams for a lot of these. The films, a lot of them are available and have been sort of restored and digitized by the Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo, who's basically within the same umbrella of the National Film Center, which is why I feel they've heavily focused on the film works.
But the digitization obviously is a vexing problem.
Yes,
for this kind of work.
For this type of work, I wasn't quite sure what they were hoping for, but I appreciated being able to watch it, but I had to watch it on a single screen and then watch the next one, but it was supposed to be a double screen projection, and these
So where are the original materials for that sort of thing are?
Oh yeah, no,
The original materials for that sort of thing are with the artists, or are they
The original films,
Yeah.
are now a lot of them for the Kyoto artists that I've discussed today.
Yeah.
A lot of them are at the Museum on Tokyo.
The
actual film, yeah.
film.
But they've also digitized it, and the idea is to have like a easy access to them on a table where you can watch it. And that's what they said they were going to do. But there was very little attention on how these were presented spatially. The slides were completely ignored.
Sounds like a great preservation project.
Yeah,
For MoMA.
and the sort of the reason given for not looking at the slides were because of the project title, which said film and video, which sounded a little absurd to me. And so I guess within the confines of that project, they were unable to explore these installations and also the contribution of the slide projections either. But
did you know that Imai Norio actually used the slide projection onto his kinetic white object that was displayed from space to environment?
Wow, right.
Yeah, he borrowed 4 slides, one each from famous photographers who were participating in the exhibition. He just simply borrowed them from those people and then put them and then projected onto his white sculpture that became a screen.
Yeah.
The screen was moving. So at the gallery Richard, he has this reconstruction of the white kinetic object.
I have to go see that show.
Yeah, I think it might have just ended.
Yeah, but I think he's coming back for another show, which was more to do with photography in the 70s.
I didn't
The name escapes me right now, but
same gallery?
Or
in New York, not the same gallery.
Should tell that,
I could quickly look it up, but
Yeah.
I think it's also to do with jointed film, which is the film installation. I don't know how he's going to present it. I know at least in Osaka he's reinstalling it with the projection.
Who is this again?
Imai Norio.
Okay.
Yeah.
The youngest member, former member of
Yeah.
Gutai.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
So resizing Osaka.
Yeah.
He's having a show in Osaka in July for the
Okay,
4 months
that's
of
the one.
Shinsaibashi, called Art Court Gallery.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a tangent. I was going to mention at the Fales Library's exhibition space now they have a show. They recently acquired a lot of club footage, videos of like the New York Underground, and somebody, I don't know if it's any good, but they have reinstalled it, trying to approximate the original Danceteria video lounge. So I really do think these reconstructions of disco culture are really important. I mean, not least because of Warhol and Gustav Metzger and a lot of people in the West that were working with, almost every expanded cinema filmmaker I've met with did light shows at some point, and I think it is a part of the history that has gone under-examined. So, I mean, it would be great to find out more about. And in a way, if you think about cross-cultural connections, too, I mean, disco was a place where you did dissolve and let go of your identity a bit, and, it's arguably a more interesting space to think about, like, cross-national networks, and how they might have been influencing each other through music and drug cultures and whatever else. But,
actually, one of the major discotheques in Japan was called Mugen.
Infinity.
Called what?
Infinity.
Mugen.
Yeah,
Infinity.
Infinity. And I mean, that space was famous for having a lot of Americans in the army bases bringing in that discotheque culture that they'd experienced over here and introducing that to some of the Japanese artists and designers there. And it became a hugely popular space for such multi-projection experiments, but also, like you said, the crossing of the boundaries between nation and identity and all that was happening at Mugen.
Was Mugen in Tokyo or Kansai?
In Tokyo. Where was it? Akasaka, I think.
Akasaka, yeah.
And also neighborhood of a lot of foreigners.
Yeah.
staying there.
Yeah.
I was actually not sure of the chronology. You didn't mention all those clubs when those were founded. Were you talking primarily after 70 or some of them happened before?
Yeah. Thanks.
After 70.
Actually, it was before
What are the
70.
dates? Some of them.
So Killer Joe's was 1968. Angura Poppu, which is another space that staged the first psychedelic shows, had people like Kanesaka Kenji and Shinohara Ushio doing these activities there. Angura Poppu was founded in 1967. There are a few called LSD, CCC. These spaces were in 1967 as well.
Space Delicious?
Space Delicious was 1969, I believe.
That's still before Expo.
Yeah, I think a lot of the activities happening in Kyoto and Osaka were sort of basically discotheques designed in preparation for the expo, in hoping people will come. There's a lot of industry and corporate attention in the region, and possibilities for engineers and artists to collaborate, and those were formed in the expo. In Osaka and Kyoto. So Space Delicious was one incarnation of that.
And Charivari?
Yeah, Charivari is Tokyo, actually.
But what year?
I think that's 69 too.
I mean, because obviously it seems like a strong Kasama connection. I mean, which came first? I mean, obviously
That's
she
true.
did, but it's still interesting.
And there were drag clubs too.
I mean, it's difficult because, of course, most of them no longer exist.
Yep.
But actually, if there's a lot of photo documentation and diagrams available in the architecture journals in Japan. There was a lot of attention on discotheque culture in those journals.
There's a lot of writing going on in those architecture journals about intermedia.
I found so much written by Yamaguchi, Katsuhiro, and Tony Atsunawa. These people writing in architecture journals, interior design journals too, and they have. And what's also interesting is the people who documented performances with photographs, such as Hara Eizaburo, were also the photographers for these architecture and design magazines. So you'd see photographs by them of chairs or tables or fashion show spatial design. But they were also taking photographs of expanded cinema performances and more sort of straight performance art activities. So I don't know how to navigate these interactions, but I'm thinking one could be the photographers that documented these, because they were in both spaces all the time, it seemed.
It's very interesting that many of the discotheques were pre-expo, and that really changes the dynamics as well. That you said that some of them were particularly done in preparation for expo. That I was wondering about the use of pneumatic tent that seems to relate to Pepsi Pavilion and all the other pavilions that use the same technology, but that same architect was involved.
No, what's interesting, another part of my research project was looking at the balloon sculptures that these artists are making before crosstalk intermedia and such. You can see with the Neo-Dada organizers, artists working with it in the early 60s on much smaller scale when the availability. Shinohara, of course, and Kazakura Sho. They were with balloon sculptures, but there was Omichi Seiji, who made balloon sculptures for window displays and sort of skate rings and these sort of more public spaces like that. Also made huge balloon sculptures for outdoor exhibitions. He made balloons for expanded cinema artists to project out onto, and so there was a lot of, I don't know what to call it, but I guess pneumatic art or balloon art happening in the run-up to 1970. In 1970, if you look at photos from bird's eye view photos of the pavilions in the Osaka exposition, maybe a third of them are sort of pneumatic tents. And I think that sort of culture of projection onto balloons sort of dies with the expo a little bit. There's a few dance events that incorporate dance and balloon and projection in 70 and 71, but after that the sort of phase of balloon and projection coming together sort of fades away by the very early 70s. And again, that's also difficult how to access these materials. They no longer exist, so most of the time I've had to rely on photographs for that too.
All right, we're already way over, very happily. It was a great discussion.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.